the Start Broadcast button.
Great. Thanks, Tony. Okay, thanks everybody for your attention on all of these matters today. We're obviously moving a bunch of these items to a future meeting or call. And with that, I'm going to close this session of the meeting, and we'll open the executive committee meeting at the closed session at 9:55. Thank you. We'll make sure we leave plenty of time for questions, answers, comments that need to be made. Item number 2 around board consent, approval of the agenda. Does anybody have any additions, deletions to the agenda, or any questions around the agenda? And I've got to toggle back and forth. So seeing no hands around the agenda, the agenda is approved by consensus. Also, approval of the February and July proceedings for 2020. Does any member of the policy board have any questions regarding that document? Seeing no hands going up or nobody commenting, the proceedings are approved. Item number 3 is public comment. Are there any members of the public that have anything that they would like to bring to the policy board that is not on the agenda? Hearing no voices, seeing no hands, we will move right through to the executive committee report. This morning, the executive committee met for a little over 2 hours, discussed many different items, and the first thing that was discussed at length was the CARES Act. Kelly Dennett from NOAA Fisheries did join us to help answer questions. I think it was a good discussion. It certainly raised some additional questions that need to be answered, and Kelly will be following up with Bob Beal, and Bob will get those back out to the executive committee. To date, Massachusetts and South Carolina have been approved. Maine, Rhode Island, Virginia, and Georgia have all submitted plans, and I'm assuming they have received or are about to receive questions regarding their plan. And hopefully the turnaround on those will be quick. I know for Maine's, the turnaround was a little over a week and a half, I guess, to get questions back. So it was a wide-ranging conversation. I'm not going to go into detail. A lot of it focused around the spend plans and that allocation. There was a brief conversation around what's going on in Congress right now about any additional CARES Act dollars that might become available. Kelly did report out that the spend plans that are developed now hopefully there'll be language that the spend plans that are being developed now can be used for future allocations. I want to stress that that's totally optional. So if states want to make a change, if we are lucky enough to get a second round of money, then we would have that flexibility going forward. Kelly did bring up the issues around the sample affidavits and showing good standing for the applicants with federal government. There was a lot of discussion around the issues of being made more than whole, and how is that going to work? I'm going by my notes, so if I misstate, I'm going to let Bob jump in. But in particular, PPP and other assistance will not be considered in the 35% loss. However, it will be considered in making an individual more than whole. So that's important to note. There was a fair amount of conversation also as it pertained to that 35% loss and what happens if it is for a distinct period of time, and then that loss is negated based on improved income later in the year. That potentially puts an individual in a place of having to pay money back. The issue was raised by New Hampshire, and I think a lot of other states certainly raised their eyebrows on that one to try to figure out how we're going to get around that, not get around it, but how we're going to address it. So that'll be something that we'll probably have to have some further conversation on as we go forward. Some additional questions around the audit as well. It's clear that whatever we're using to support, whatever the states are using to support the distribution of the funds would have to be available for those states and potentially even for the agency for audits in the future. And as I said earlier, Kelly we had a few questions she was not able to answer, and so she'll be following up directly with Bob Beal, and Bob will get that information back out to the executive committee. That was the first item. Does anybody have any questions around the CARES Act that either Bob or I might be able to answer? Seeing no hands, I'm just going to keep going down through my report. We went out of order. Back up to item number 4 on the executive committee was the AOC report. The oversight committee reviewed the budget that was submitted by staff, and after several conversations with staff and answering questions, the AOC moved to the executive committee that the budget for FY21 be approved, and that was the budget was approved without objection. The AOC also reported out around unspent funds related to contractual agreements. I believe the document has been made available for the policy board, but the practice that we currently have in place was memorialized in a policy document. After discussion with the AOC had some minor changes. Those were presented this morning to the executive committee, and again, those were approved without objection. Also related to the AOC report was an issue that was brought up by Richie White from New Hampshire around the use of unspent funds and the need for a policy. Bob Beal informed me that there was the beginning of a policy being developed prior to COVID as it pertained to unspent funds and how or what type of policy we should have in place. Based on that conversation and knowing that that work is already ongoing, Bob and Laura are going to dust off that document, do some additional work on it. That will be brought back to the executive committee, and then the executive committee will then report out to the policy board. I'm just going to keep moving on, and then we'll circle back for questions at the end if there are any questions. Agenda item number 6, back in the order, was a report by the Science and Management Committee, and this was a report that was presented by Sarah Murray, and it was on public participation through the advisory panel process and through public hearing process. It was a very thorough review by the Science and Management Committee. We're really focused on public engagement, exploring strategies and efficiencies on how to reach stakeholders. The Executive Committee did have some conversation around stipends as a way to encourage people, but it was pointed out that stipends for advisory panel members, where there are not stipends for commissioners, that are not part of a state agency or on any legislative staff, potentially could be problematic. And so some additional conversations around that may be needed in the future. One of the ideas around this was to try to find ways to develop some accountability. So if people are participating and they're receiving some sort of stipend, that they would have to have accountability. But again, based on the fact that there is some budgetary constraints around that and the fact that there would be some inequities, I think more conversations around that need to take place. Also around public participation was the issues around a possible hybrid approach to include both in-person meetings and webinar kind of combined. I know through the New England Council, we're going to do that on Amendment 23 on groundfish, at least within Maine, trying to bring some people together that will participate in an in-house meeting as we do some additional work through a webinar. So I think those are the type of things, especially in this pandemic, we're going to have to start thinking outside the box on how this hybrid approach could be utilized. And then lastly, there was more talk about how we can do a better job educating advisory panel members in particular. The thought that advisors aren't listened to, or they don't listen to us in a general statement was discussed. We talked about how we can improve the expectations of the advisor, that their input is part of a larger process, and how can we move in a direction to do a better job educating, so people are aware of what that input means and how it is being considered. So I'm gonna pause there. I know I've gone through a couple, just make sure I don't have any hands up. I don't see any hands up, so I'm gonna continue to move down the list. Item number 7 is a topic that has come up and has been presented around Pennsylvania's participation on the Menhaden board. A letter was submitted to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has now responded through their attorneys with a letter of disagreement. Chris Coons on the executive committee did a very good job explaining the rationale behind that letter. A lot of conversation on this, a lot of states recognizing the fact that Pennsylvania is very committed to Menhaden and the conservation of Menhaden, and that we have a compact that we have their participation being in conflict with the compact. And so our attorney, after reviewing, the ASMFC's attorney, after reviewing Pennsylvania's letter, has asked Bob for some additional information. That information will be presented in a letter form back to Pennsylvania, and there's been no final decision on this, and additional conversations will happen at the executive committee with the plan forward being brought to the policy board at a later date. Item number 8 was to consider the division or dividing the South Atlantic board. Bob may want to weigh in on this, or Tony, if any conversations need to take place around this. But at this time, the executive committee, because of lack of time on the agenda, have pushed this off to a later call. So we certainly will have more around that issue in a future meeting. Jay McNamee, would you like to bring the issue up around that participation, about Rhode Island's participation?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. I'll try and be really brief, and it kind of connects with this, I think. But in any case, going back a little over a year, the ASMFC reached out to Rhode Island. I think what was going on was the cobia assessment was going on, and what the commission noticed was Rhode Island had a bunch of commercial landings. In fact, it was they were higher than I think some of the states that are currently on the South Atlantic board, and so they reached out to Rhode Island to investigate a little bit whether those were just boats that were actually fishing down south and then landing up here or not. And what we discovered was the majority of those landings were coming out of our floating fish trap fishery, which is an inshore fixed gear, kind of akin to like pound nets, kind of a gear like that. So long story short, those were legitimately fish being caught in Rhode Island waters. So that was both interesting and the question that was posed to us is, hey, do you want to get involved in the management of cobia, or what would Rhode Island think about joining into the management process for Cobia. So we kicked that around a little bit and investigated kind of what our landings are still in the grand scheme of things fairly small. But we were looking at what that would mean by way of regulations and things like that. So long story short, after a consultation with folks in the industry and within state government, we thought we might be interested in getting involved. We thought, it would be good if this trend continues, that Rhode Island should be a part of the management process if restrictions need to be made or what have you. We should be a part of that if there are landings occurring in our area. And it was an opportunity for us to be involved in any of that management process. So we are interested certainly in getting involved. I think it would be focused on cobia. I don't think it would connect with any of the other South Atlantic species, at least at this point, right? But that's where we are at. So we wanted to at least get that out on the table for the folks in the South Atlantic board to think about, and it may connect in with this decision of splitting the South Atlantic board. Haven't quite wrapped my head around, if that is a critical element or not. But in any case, I'll stop yammering away here, Mr. Chair, and that's all I wanted to offer for today.
Thanks, Jason. I do have a couple of hands up. I'm assuming they're on this topic, but before we do, I think we have determined that the executive committee will get additional information on this topic from staff, and we can put this as a placeholder as part of those discussions. So I've got Joe Cimino and Lynn Fagley. Joe?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I apologize. I didn't test my mic earlier, so hopefully everyone can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Great, thank you. Yeah, well, I think I support this notion, and if it does become Spanish mackerel and cobia as a separate board, I think there are several states that are going to want to be considered. My question is, since we have and this may be Lynn's as well, we have a cobia addendum going forward, and we recognized the other day that we're losing Dr. Schmidtke, so I don't know who on staff could help advise us, but should we be pausing on that addendum, or is the concept of adding newer states something that would be a new amendment, in which case let's get through this addendum and then we start a new amendment when we look at adding other states. But I was just hoping to get some guidance from staff on should that addendum still be moving forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Tony?
Help there, or for adding states to a management board, Joe, that is something that the policy board approves. There are guidelines in the compact that we follow when adding states to a board, so you don't have to change the addendum for that. And then that management body would be updated in the next management document. I don't know if Bob has anything else to add there.
Bob either is still having microphone troubles or he has nothing else to
I'm unmuted by the organizer. I got a theme for the day.
you do?
Yeah, no, I don't have much to add. That can be a policy board decision. The commission can move states on and off management boards based on policy board action. It doesn't take a addendum or an amendment to do that.
Could I, Mr. Chair, sorry, just a quick follow-up?
Yeah, please, Joe.
I think, and I appreciate that. I can't pretend I knew all that information that well, but I was being a little bit more specific to the cobia addendum itself. Would it complicate it if there were new states involved? Do we need to think through that whole process of what this particular addendum is doing for us? And should we pause to wait to see if we need to consider other states or not? Thank you.
Great, thank you, Joe. I've got Lynn Fagley and then Jim Gilmore.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just, that was not my question, but it's a good one. So just to follow up, if I may, very quickly on Joe's point, I think if the policy board decides to split the South Atlantic, then we would really want to make sure with this addendum that Rhode Island has the ability, if they want to declare an interest, to participate in that public comment, because there is some pretty, there's some very specific measures for de minimis states, which I assume Rhode Island would be. So I think that is something we need to consider. But I also wanted to say that, and I had conversed with Tony about this a little bit yesterday, the spot addenda, the spot FMP resides in an omnibus with Spanish mackerel, and one is a cyanid and one is a pelagic. And, Pat Gear and I used to talk about splitting out spot from that omnibus, because it seems to always go together with croaker. So it's a little bit of work for staff to do a spot addendum and a croaker addendum, when potentially they could just do a spot and croaker addendum. But it's also work to split spot out and put it with croaker. But I was curious if the board was split into a cyanid and a pelagic sections, would that push the issue? Would we need to pull spot out of that omnibus, which I actually think would be a good idea, but I just wanted to check on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Lynn. Tony, you want to comment on that?
I will do my best. And Bob can correct me if I'm wrong based on our conversation last night. I think that we would be okay. What we would do is the omnibus is actually Spanish mackerel, spot, and spotted sea trout. And we have had individual addenda that relate to individual species for under that omnibus. So we could continue to do addenda for Spanish mackerel on their own, but then when we were to go forward with our next amendment, the next time we did it, then we would be pulling it out of the omnibus and into an amendment on its own. And if you recall, back in the 90s, Spanish mackerel was its own FMP. So it started off as its own, moved into the omnibus because I think there was a lot of similar management frameworks for those three species. We thought it would be easier to combine them. And now we are finding ourselves in the place where we think we might need to be splitting them out. So I think just when we come upon the next amendment, we would do that, and then that would be okay otherwise.
Okay, thanks, Tony. Jim Gilmore?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Just a comment at this point. A couple of years ago, New York was invited to by leadership to join in on the South Atlantic Board because of cobia, and we declined because at that point it was sort of an all in or all out, and it was just sort of a workload thing. We didn't roll a species we'd have to be involved with, and now that Rhode Island's considering at least getting in this and is commenting on cobia, or even maybe more involved with the management, we will have to rethink that, because I'm not sure how well it makes sense that states like New York and Connecticut too, I'm not sure how much activity Connecticut's having on cobia, but we're having probably the same amount as Rhode Island, and not that I want to make more work, but now that if it's not an all-in thing, but if we are going to consider maybe splitting the South Atlantic Board up into different species, we'd have to think about that again. And so just at this point, I just wanted to, we originally had opted out of it, but maybe we need to reconsider that. And actually, this is going to be happening for maybe a bunch of species as we progress into our northern migration. That, Mr. Chairman, you took all our lobsters, so we don't have to worry about them anymore. But we got a lot of things coming up that we never really thought about. So as we progress on this, we'll again have to rethink it, and like to see if Connecticut has any desires to get on this. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim. Any other comments on this before we move on? We don't see any other hands. Anybody on the phone have a comment? Hearing none, seeing none. As I stated earlier, the executive committee is tabled this for future conversation. I think we can, based on the comments we've heard here today from the policy board, we can add those into the mix. And then I think as long as the timing works, we can report out at the October meeting. If there's no objections to that, I'll finalize my report and then we can move on with the agenda. Under other business, there were several issues that brought up. The first being the annual meeting. We are 3 months away from our annual meeting in New Jersey. Both Spud and Bob and I have had several conversations about this meeting over the last several weeks. And I mean, the fact of the matter remains that the COVID-19 pandemic is still in full swing. We have states that are on this call that are likely lit up as hotspots. And the idea of trying to bring everybody together into New Jersey to complete our annual meeting is just not in the cards for us this year. So the executive committee, after some discussion, agreed that the annual meeting should be moved to a virtual meeting, just as this one. And one question was brought up around the fact that is there a way to combine commissioners and put them in one spot and maybe having using videos as part of that, or maybe even not using video. So staff is going to look into that a little bit more to see if the GoToWebinar would work for a little bit of a slightly hybrid approach for the executive committee for the annual meeting. It was also agreed at that time that we would just not remove New Jersey from the list, but we will just shift over a year. So New Jersey will be hosting in 2021. They've done a tremendous amount of work on this annual meeting. We're sad to see it not happen, but we believe that now would be prudent to make that delay. So that was the other. And Bob, I don't think the policy board needs to make a call on this or affirm the executive committee's recommendation. If you could jump in and share your thoughts on that, I'd appreciate it before I move on.
I think that's correct, Pat. You know, it was unanimous at the executive committee that changing this year's annual meeting, unfortunately, to virtual is the way to go, and adjusting the schedule to have New Jersey be the host for next year. And I don't think there is any need for the policy board to take action on that. The executive committee can make that decision.
Great, thank you. The only other thing under new business was a letter that was submitted by Commissioner Tom Foti as it pertained to working groups. It was focused on some of the work on the striped bass working group, but I don't think at the end of the day, Tom was not trying to say that the results of that were flawed. He was trying to raise the issue of participation and state participation, and trying to make it a little bit more holistic as far as participation, making sure states are included. Certainly the policy that we have in place now was followed. There was nothing out of the ordinary around that. It's just continued observation that he wanted to put forward. In doing so, Tom did make a statement. I had a long conversation with Tom, a very excellent conversation with Tom around an individual who was on the working group. I talked to that individual. He said no problem stating this publicly, but as you all know, Richie White, an outstanding member of the commission, had to have emergency open heart surgery, corrective heart surgery. He was not on the committee. Tom was not aware of that. So there was some dynamics in Tom's letter that made him lose sight, or made the message around the working groups kind of lost in that conversation. So this was brought up at the executive committee. I'm bringing it up here today to say that the executive committee has tabled that conversation to a future date. And we will look at the issues around the makeup of future work groups that pertains to species boards and that work. So again, the fact that the striped bass working group, I think, did a really great job. Marty and Megan did a fantastic job being open and transparent, probably much so, more so than any other work group that I've been involved with. So I want to commend them for their work on the work group and the fact that a very balanced document has been presented now to the Striped Bass Board. So that we'll have more conversations around that at the executive committee level, and those may come back to the policy board as well. And then the last item was the item of our executive director. We went into closed session for this, as we do for all staff-related issues. In this case, it was the annual performance review for Bob Beal. Spud and I took a little bit of a different approach to it. Whether Bob agreed or liked it or not, I'm not sure. But I know that with my senior staff, I use a self-evaluation approach, and we did that with Bob after he submitted to us his annual duties, which are many. We asked him to pare it down to a minimum of 10, and I think he put a few more on than that. And we asked him to do some self-reflecting. And when people do this, they're harder on themselves than that of their manager. Bob was very open and honest about his review and about these items. He elevated some things that could be worked on. We had Spud and I had very good conversations around those. That document was presented to the executive committee, and I am pleased to announce that we continue to be nothing but thrilled with Bob's performance, especially during this time of a global pandemic. All of us are affected in one way, shape, form, or another. And then many of us on this call have to deal with it not only for ourselves and reflecting on how it's impacting ourselves, but how it's impacting our staff. So Bob not only has that on his plate and how to deal with staff, but also how to deal with the issues around all of the commissioners from Maine to Florida. And I've often said, and I repeated it today, that an executive director has to be the chief cook and bottle washer, and in this case, he's got to be an administrator, a fishery scientist, a policy advisor, and frankly, a therapist to a lot of us. With that, I'm pleased to announce the executive committee's full support of Bob Beal, and would like to thank him both personally and on behalf of the executive committee and the board for the work he continues to do. And with that, I will conclude my report and will be happy to answer any questions around any of these items that the board may have. And I am not seeing any hands go up. So with that, I will conclude the report of the executive committee, and we'll move right down to the next item, which is Jason McNamee with a progress update on the risk and uncertainty policy. Jason?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I assume I've got a present, hey, there it is. And so I'll just kind of ask to flip the slides when we're ready for that. So thank you for the help on the other end there. So this is an update on the risk and uncertainty policy that we have been talking about. So we went kind of dark on this for a little while, and a lot of that had to do with several of the folks who are kind of pushing this forward got wrapped up in the ERP work. So that's kind of why we haven't seen too much on this in a while, but we're back. And so we just wanted to give you an update. And there was actually some work going on this as well, and that's what we're talking to you about today. Next slide, please. So just a little background. The idea was to develop a process that could be used for many different risk decisions made by the ISFMP, and the attributes of doing that were we would be creating a systematic process to deal with what we're trying to do with risk at the commission, and to make the process more transparent. We assess risk all the time when we make management decisions, but a lot of times it's kind of murky and can be different depending on which commissioner is kind of making the decisions. So the original idea that we had to kind of develop the system was to develop a decision tree to implement this process. And if you remember, we kind of jokingly called it Plinko. You sort of entered into this this decision tree, and you bounce your way down to the bottom, and at the end you get a probability of management success. And so you kind of add and subtract buffers as you go. And next slide. This is just a look at sorry, next slide. There it is. So this is just a reminder of what that looked like, and this isn't even all of it. This is just a portion that we could fit on a slide. So it's pretty a lot of questions and a lot of plinkoing to do with this old system. Next slide. So what we did the last time we all spoke was we had taken the system that we had developed and we wanted to put it in front of some other groups and actually try it on a species. And at the time we decided to try it on striped bass. So the striped bass technical committee and the committee for economic and social science were consulted, and they took a crack at trying to both give us some advice on parts, and that's what the CES was doing, and the striped bass TC tried to apply it to striped bass. And so we developed a preliminary striped bass example. What came out of that, and again, this was an experiment, and it was a successful one because we learned a ton. And what we came to the realization of was that this approach was fairly brittle, is the word we've been using for it. And what we mean by that is anytime you would add new information, or if you adjust the importance of any one of those categories or decisions, you'd have to redo the entire tree, because what was happening was it was just additive and subtracting as you kind of went down. And so if you added in a new question, or if you had an extreme event, so something that really got pinned to a decision or an answer within the decision tree that was really significant and really extreme, you'd have to redo the whole tree to make it kind of perform the way you want it to. So it was an important experiment, and we learned a lot by going through it. Next slide. One of the things that came out was one of the members of the CES committee said, hey, you should rethink your approach, and I've got an idea of a better method to help you kind of deal with these aspects that make your existing system kind of brittle. So we took his advice, and we revised the approach, and also the striped bass TC, when they went through it, interestingly, they ended up having to kind of cobble together some interpolations, I guess I'll call them, and that was actually very much in line with the advice that we got from the CES committee. And so those two things kind of came together and gave us a consistent signal. So we made some refinements to the information included in the approach, the inputs, and we also developed a new formula for combining the inputs into a final probability of management success. Next slide. So the following information is incorporated into the risk and uncertainty decision tool, and it's split into 4 categories. And so I won't go through all of this in the table, but remember, you've got a set of, sorry, one slide back. You've got a set of information that's about the stock assessment, so it's kind of the technical determinations. Then you've got a set of information on the uncertainty that's involved for that particular species and the information that's involved with that species. Next slide. And then we had a couple of other categories, like the additional risk determinations, like the trophic importance of that species, and then a bunch of stuff on excuse me, the economic and social considerations. I think the table is mislabeled there. Sorry about that. But we've got both short-term and long-term economic and social considerations with regard to the commercial sector and the recreational sector. So that stuff is all still in there. And there are further details on all of that stuff in the technical committee guidance document that you can take a look at. I think it was in the materials that were posted. So one recommendation that we want you to think about is one thing we could do is task the assessment science committee and the management and science committee and the SES with developing specific criteria for each input. There's some already there, and they could kind of look through that and decide if there should be some other things in there. Next slide. And now a little bit about the new approach, and this is your old pal Jay Mack talking to you. So of course there's got to be an equation in here at some point, right? But don't get scared. It's not that bad. So like the decision tree, the new formula incorporates all of the inputs that we talked about before, all of those questions in the decision tree and the answers, and it incorporates them into a final probability of management success. So I won't belabor this equation too much, other than to show you there's that little superscript in the bottom part of the first equation there. With a capital Z, and what you see contained within that is you've got all of these little components, and all those are the, for instance, the little X1, that's just the answer to question 1 in the decision tree. And now the thing before it, the little B1, that is going to be a weighting of that. So you can give that more importance or less importance in the overall decision process. And then there's a constant there as well. And just to kind of orient you to that, if you wanted to go in with a probability of 50% probability of management success, you would just set that constant A to 0. So you can kind of adjust that depending on where you want to be with regard to your starting point for your management success. Next slide. Okay, so a little bit easier way to kind of understand this is the new formula is a sigmoid function. That's another, or a logistic formula. These are 2 other ways of kind of describing the same thing. So it uses this sigmoid function to address the issues identified in the preliminary decision tree, that brittleness. And so specifically, it's easily adapted to to any new information you want to plug in. It's consistent across species, even if the information available is different, and it's able to handle extreme cases. So you can put in really high values into that Z equation I just talked about on the last slide, but it all always gets kind of crunched into fitting within normal probability range from 0 to 1. So by separating the technical information from the weightings, the approach can be more transparent and easier to use. Next slide. So I'm going to get into a quick example here, and this will kind of show you exactly how this could work in kind of a hypothetical world. And so let's pretend that we need to set a TAC for a species. And so that first decision we need to make before we can get some information about the TACs that we have available to us is what the probability should be for that TAC with regard to F, fishing mortality, being at or below the F target. So if we want a higher probability of management success, we would have a lower TAC because that would be more risk averse. And if we want it to be a little more risky in that decision for whatever reason and have a lower probability of management success, we would end up with a higher TAC. So that would be a little more risk prone. But we can make those decisions based on our risk policy. Next slide. So here you have a panel with 4 plots in it. And this example demonstrates how both the inputs and the weightings affect the final probability of management success. So in this case, what you're looking at is the default starting probability of management success being 50%. That's something that we tend to use a lot. So if you look at the top left panel, that shows a situation where you're not overfished and overfishing is not occurring. So you can see that little box falls right on the 50% line. Then to the right, that shows a case when both the biomass and the fishing mortality are between the target and the threshold. So you can see that this increases the final probability of management success slightly. You know, not too much, but you can see that little gray box is now up above that 50% line. So, you know, whatever it is, like 55% or something like that. The bottom left shows when either the stock is overfished or overfishing is occurring. So you're not doing great in one of your metrics. And so what you can see is now this boosts that probability of management success up a little bit higher. Now you're clearly up above the 50% line. And then the bottom right, that's your kind of extreme case when the stock is both overfished and overfishing is occurring, and you can see that results in the largest increase in probability. You're the highest up on the curve there in that case. And so for the next, I think 3 slides, excuse me, you will, this format will be the same. So the, you know, your stock status will be in the same position in each case. But now we're going to add in a couple of new scenarios so you can see how these things interact with the decision process. Next slide. Okay, so now this figure shows those same scenarios but adds a layer of the fact that we have high levels of uncertainty somewhere within our decision process. And so what you see that's new on the plots here is an orange circle, and that is showing that you have high uncertainty in some element for this hypothetical species. And what you can see happens is that little orange circle kind of sits just above the gray box that we talked about on the last slide. And so you can see, because you have high uncertainty, you want to be a little bit more risk averse. And so now all of those same decisions that you would make are kind of boosted up a little bit as far as your probability of management success that you get out of this decision tool. Next slide. This case demonstrates how accounting for negative socioeconomic impacts of the management action would reduce the probability of management success. So this pushes back on the increases that you would get otherwise. Just an important note here is that the magnitude of these shifts depends on both the information that's driving it and on the weighting determined by the board. And so that will make all of these things slide further up or further down, you know, on the curve. But for this example, the board could weight short-term socioeconomic impacts as relatively high. And so that would increase the effect from what you're seeing up on the screen, or you could downweight it and that would decrease the effect. But what you see here is now we have a blue triangle on there, and you can see that because we're, in this case, putting emphasis on the negative short-term socioeconomic impacts, you can see that even in that base case, you're pushing down below, so you're being more risk-prone, you know, in that top left box. But in all of the cases, because you have this potential short-term negative socioeconomic consequence, you're shifting your probability of management success down in each case. So you're being more risk-prone. And then next slide, final scenario, and I'm almost done, Mr. Chair, I promise. There is now I'll call it a purple diamond on the screen. And so in this case, what we're trying to demonstrate is incorporating long-term positive socioeconomic impacts of a management action. So if you, you know, were more risk averse, you would get better socioeconomic consequences in the future. And so that's what this case is demonstrating for you. And so in these cases where you wanted to emphasize the long-term effects because they have more positive benefit, you can see that in this case, these would be the most risk-averse, you know, decisions that you would make in this scenario. So it boosts up the probability of management success that you would apply to your management action. So incorporating both short-term and long-term, as well as allowing these things to be both positive and negative in their directionality on the socioeconomic components, it allows the board to transparently account for those types of trade-offs. Next slide. So the decision tool will be developed by the species board. So the crafting of the specific decision process will be done by the individual species boards. They'll do that in collaboration with the technical committee. And this will be done in a process that's separate from the management decision. So you'll kind of do that ahead of time. And this could be an iterative process. So the board can provide feedback on the weightings, and the decision tool answers when they see the results. So you can kind of have like a process that has feedback, but the ideal would be to set your weightings and things like that a priori, so that you're kind of making those initial weighting judgments before you have kind of a pressing management decision to make. And then the final bullet there, the probability of management success will be used then by the technical committee or the plan development team to develop the management options. And so instead of the situations where the board ends up saying, hey, give us a probability of management success between 30 and 75%, and then kind of looking at the answers and making a judgment, you'll kind of make a priori decision of how you want the emphasis to go into the decision process, and then we would have a much smaller range, or actually potentially a single value in the end. And so it cuts down on the workload and the amount of decision making that the board has to do after the fact. Next slide. So any feedback on this revised risk and uncertainty approach as a whole would be something we're looking at from this group. So that's something to kind of think about. Additionally, the board could use surveys or voting technology. Remember, we did that process a year or so ago with the clickers. It's kind of like a live voting, surveying thing that we were doing with the board, which was kind of fun. So we could do something like that to collectively determine the weighting preferences. So remember, the boards are going to have to set these weights ahead of time. So we wanted to know what you thought about that as an approach. And then the socioeconomic questions are currently the only components that can be both negative and positive. So it could both increase and decrease the probability of management success. And we were wondering if you wanted to incorporate other components of the decision process that could be both positive and negative as well. And then last slide, potential next steps for you to consider are we could incorporate any feedback that you have today, and then what we could do is take that and then work with the ASC, MSC, and CESS to refine the criteria for the decision tool inputs. And then what we can do is take that and revise the striped bass example to fit this new approach, including a test run with the striped bass board. And one final thing I wanted to leave you with is we met with the risk and uncertainty working group that had been developed, and they generally like this. But during that discussion, they brought up the notion that there may be some other examples we might want to test this on. Specifically, they brought up lobster and menhaden as other viable candidates. But for the short term, we thought continuing to focus on striped bass might be a good way to move this forward. But I wanted to at least mention that advice about lobster and menhaden that came out of the working group. So, Mr. Chair, that is it for me, and I am more than happy to take any questions that anybody has on this.
Thanks, Jason. Very thorough report as always, and I particularly love the reference to you being our buddy, our pal, as I was walking out to get my Advil to think about the details around this. A couple hands have already gone up. Justin Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for that presentation, Jay. This is really cool. I like it. I don't know if it would be possible to put up the slide further back with the actual formula, but in the meantime, I guess my question was, so in looking at this, so you've got your different inputs, which will reflect things like socioeconomic factors and the condition of the stock. And those would be represented here by sort of the X1s and the X2s. And those would, my first question is, those would presumably be scored like on a 1 to 5 sort of scale or something like that. And then there would sort of need to be some decision about how that's handled. And then the different, what we would think of as kind of the slopes here in a multiple regression, but the B1s and the B2s, the weightings, those, I think, would those have to sum to 1 so that essentially, like if you're setting one at 0.25 and another one at 0.5, that's directly saying we're considering the one that you're putting the 0.5 in front of as twice as important? Or are we going to have to set those factors such that they kind of like produce a certain outcome overall of overall probability of management success, those figures you showed with the sigmoid curve, that they sort of, given a certain set of scenarios, you end up someplace on that? I guess I'm just wondering sort of like how the decisions would be made about those weightings. So those are my 2 questions, if those make sense.
Yeah. Really good questions, Justin. So let me see. I'll start with the latter question, and the way you characterized it at first is correct. So they would need to sum to 1, and that kind of controls, where it ends up. So actually, I'll skip what I was just about to say. So you are correct. They need to kind of sum to 1, and the way that you described it, weighting certain things over another is exactly right. So if you put, you know, a larger B1, you know, next to the X1 relative to a smaller B2 next to the X2, B1 is what you're giving the most influence to within the equation. And I am sorry, I have forgotten your very first question.
Yeah, so my first question was for the inputs, the X1s and the X2s, would those be something that's sort of like scored on a scale of like 1 to 5 or something like that? And so would that be another decision point of how you come up with your scoring criteria for those?
Yeah. So yes, and that was actually the thing that kind of brought this whole thing to the fore. When we brought this to the CES, they were kind of struggling with the way we had it constructed, because a lot of, in particular, social science information comes out of things like Likert scales and you know, things like that, and so they don't lend themselves well to adding 0.05 or something like that, whereas some of the technical stuff does, you know, because that comes directly out of the assessment information. So, you know, trying to cobble those different types of things together and make the end results be something that is useful and meaningful, that's what created our challenge and is what led to this. And so that's exactly right. You would need, but I think that some of that stuff could avail itself. And I think in some of the background information that was also posted with this, there's a little more information on this very topic where, you know, socioeconomic questions could be scored 1 to 5. And so that's what you'd be doing there. And then for the technical information, you could be, you know, adding, giving it scores between 0 and 1, you know, things like that. So yeah, I think you've got this exactly right, Dr. Davis.
Great. Anybody else have any questions for Jason? And if staff could go to the final slide, the recommendation.
Thank you. You add me to the queue. This is John Clark.
Yeah, John, I've got Lynn Fagley, and then we'll go to you, John.
Thanks.
Lynn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Jason, thank you for this. This came out I'm just really excited about how well this worked out. I remember those early meetings when we got so excited about Plinko. I may have been a little skeptical, but this really, thank you for all the work on this and the great presentation. I wanted to just highlight 2 things. One is, I think this idea that the development of the you know, of the uncertainty level is separate from a management decision. I think that that's really important, that this is done a priori, so that it's not happening at the same time that people have great concerns and fears about particular and likely necessary management action. So I think that a priori piece of it is important. And that kind of brings me to the second part of my question is, you know, reference points are set differently for different species. And in some cases they are, you know, the reference point, a threshold reference point really might be indicative of a border between stock collapse and stock sustenance. And in other cases, maybe not so much. And you know, I have been known to say to some of our constituents that, you know, when we manage fisheries, we kind of use the science to create a box for you that we don't want to go outside of in management. That's our safety area. And what we do within that safety area is very much the, you know, where we need the input from all of our diverse array of stakeholders. So my question really is just about the short-term economic impact weighting factor and how we sort of ensure, because that's always the scariest thing, right? Short-term economics is always the scariest thing. So I guess my sort of process thought question to the board is, how do we ensure, as boards are walking through this process, that we make sure that we're maintaining that safety box while we're figuring out the weight of short-term economic impacts, if I phrase that so that it makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I can respond if you like.
Yeah, please do.
Okay, thanks for that, Lynn. That was great, and completely agree with you on the transparency aspect of it, and making sure that, you know, we at least set things up ahead of time based on the risk policy and not based on kind of the heat of the moment. I think that's super important as well. And then I think your question about, and I like thinking, I like the way you've sort of visualized that as the box, and I think that is actually another important factor that I didn't touch on explicitly here, but there may be, you know, for instance, we don't want to go all the way to 100 or all the way down to 0 as far as the, you know, the management, the risk advice, the probability of management success that we get out of this tool. So that's another decision factor if we want to kind of bound this, and I'm just making stuff up, but to not go below 40% or above 75% or something like that. So that's kind of one aspect of what you're talking about. And then so that's another thing that we'll have to work through. And then and that's a higher level decision. So that could be like the ISFMP, that kind of sets that with advice from the boards if we want an overarching set of criteria. But in another context, I think the short-term and long-term socioeconomic considerations, you can also work within the species-specific arena and just weight those things to make sure you're not putting too much emphasis on those, you know, on those factors, and so you don't kind of pin yourself always, you know, at the bottom end of the box, for instance, because you know, lots of times there's going to be significant socioeconomic consequences in the short term. So I think that's where the weighting becomes really important. And so that's why doing a standalone meeting where we kind of work through those weightings with some scenario testing and things like that, that I think would be a really good approach to setting those weightings.
Thanks, Jason. Does anybody else have any additional questions for Jason? I don't see any others.
I do.
Oh,
Pat,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks, Pat. And I wish I could have seen your presentation, Jason. I was following along in the memo, and it's very interesting. And my question kind of follows up on Lynn's, in that I notice on the socioeconomics, because it's the only one that goes from a negative to a positive, is it possible that those could all just negate each other? Like if the short-term economic impact is -5 weighted for the one, and then +5 for the long-term, you know, like short-term, long-term, they could then, you could end up in a situation where these human dimensions determination ends up having no impact on the final probability?
Yeah, really good question, John. Thanks for that. The answer is yes. And so, but that would only be the case if, in the end, your weightings on those competing factors were exactly the same. So if you had, you know, a weighting of 0.1 on the one that you had on the negative side and 0.1 on the positive side, and then you scored them exactly the same. So there's kind of like multiple components at play. But if you have the same weightings and then gave them the same scores, then yes, they would cancel each other out. They are, in fact, influencing your final determination. Though it's not, the result seems like it hasn't had an influence, but it does. I mean, what you're saying is, we think that short-term influence and the long-term influence are both super important, and that's why they've kind of canceled themselves out, and then the other components of the decision process, they kind of determine where you end up on the curve. But that would be something that would avail itself during kind of the weighting exercise that you're doing with the board. And so you could do that kind of a scenario, and then the board could decide, well, we don't want them to have equal weight, so they don't do that, every time or some of the time or whatever it is. So there's ways to construct it so that doesn't happen frequently. But long-winded answer to your question, the answer was yes, that can happen.
Thanks, Jay. As I said, it's just more one of those perceptions that a lot of times we'll say it's short-term pain for long-term gain. And, having a formula that can actually end up trying to show that is great, but it could also end up being something that kind of minimizes the economic impact. Thanks.
Yep. Thank you, John. We've certainly got a very thorough report here by Jason and the group on risk and uncertainty. Jason, I think you've got some feedback with some very good questions here. There was some discussion or comment in the potential next steps about working with 3 different groups to refine the criteria. It would seem to me, based on the questions, there's some revisions and refining that need to be done. Is there any disagreement from the policy board about continuing with this work and getting an additional report back at a later meeting? I don't see any hands going up. Jason, I'm going to take that as affirmative to my question to the policy board. Do you need any additional input based on that?
Nope, I think that's it, Mr. Chair. And thanks to everybody for tuning in and thinking about this a little bit. And so, with that affirmation, it also sounds like the sticking with the striped bass example is the way to go. So we'll get to work on that, and we'll be back.
Great. Thank you very much, Jason. That's great work. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
I'm going to do a quick time check. We've got till 12:05 on the agenda. We could probably run a little bit long. I know it's going to bump up into a meeting for me, but Tony, we've got committee reports coming up. Do you have a sense of the timing around those?
I think they'll be fairly quick, all of them. I know that some can be sped up a little if necessary.
Okay, great. We have both Sarah and Lisa in the queue to present these reports. So why don't we move right to the assessment and science committee and a report from Sarah Murray.
Okay, great. I'll try to be, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll try to be as fast as possible. All right, so next slide, please. So the ASC met on May 20th to discuss a number of issues, including the stock assessment schedule, which is the main purpose of this presentation. I did want to also note that there were plans to hold an advanced stock assessment training on management and strategy evaluations, and those have been postponed due to COVID-19. We're working on rescheduling that and determining whether we would like to host that as a webinar training or hold it as an in-person training and hold off until that is feasible. Next slide, please. Okay, so the proposed stock assessment schedule is available here. It is also available in your meeting materials, as I know these are rather small words. The ASC discussed and approved the draft stock assessment schedule at their meeting, and this schedule, again, available in your meeting materials, but I'll review some of the highlights of the changes that occurred since the 2019 annual meeting. Next slide, please. So first 2 additional years were added for 2023 and populated based on the NIVS schedule and standard ASMFC assessment frequencies. The Horseshoe Crab Adaptive Resource Management, or ARM framework benchmark, was added to the schedule in 2021. That was already scheduled for that time, but the ARM hadn't been included on the schedule previously. Jonah Crab was tentatively scheduled for 2023 for a first-time assessment. The details are still being sorted out on that. Next slide. So one of the key challenges that ASC discussed was that there is a bottleneck of assessments scheduled for 2022. On the last schedule that was approved by the board, there were 11 benchmarks and 4 assessments scheduled in 2022. So to try to reduce some of this bottleneck, the ASC recommended the following changes. 1, to shift croaker to 2024 from 2022, shift Atlantic sturgeon from 2022 to 2024, and to shift spot from 2022 to 2024. Next slide, please. The river herring assessment, there's also a recommendation to shift that on the schedule to 2023. This is really just to reflect the substantial workload and time that is needed to complete that update. And finally, striped bass on the schedule remained the same as the last approved schedule, which is with a tentative assessment update in 2021. However, the ASC recommended consulting the Striped Bass Management Board and Technical Committee on the pros and cons of shifting the update to a later year. Next slide. And so this is the final proposed schedule from ASC, and with that, I would be happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you. Is there any questions from the policy board? Not seeing any questions coming up right now. We do have some suggested schedule changes that have been presented. Does anybody have any concerns regarding the schedule changes that have been presented?
Pat, this is Bob Beal, real quick, Pat.
Go ahead, Bob.
The only one that popped into my head, and I should have talked to staff about it earlier, is delaying sturgeon until 2024. I don't know if that causes any problem with any pending ESA reviews that NOAA Fisheries might be having, given the threatened and endangered listing of Atlantic sturgeon up and down the coast. So I'm not sure if the Management Science Committee group thought about that, or if that's something as staff we need to go back and check on. But just thought just popped in my head.
No, I appreciate that, Bob. I think that is considering some conversations around possible changes in the future. I would recommend that staff check into that just to make sure we're not going to be missing any deadlines as far as an assessment, because if we could see changes in any listing criteria based on that assessment, that would be a good thing. Go ahead, Sarah.
Oh, sure. Yeah, if you don't mind. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to note, and other staff, please chime in if I'm mischaracterizing this, but I believe we were looking into this both in regards to river herring and Atlantic sturgeon, and we didn't think that this would present an issue for Atlantic sturgeon. Tony or Katie, if you have other information, just let me know.
I think we'll have to check in with NOAA Fisheries. I did check on the shad and river herring questions, but I did not check in on sturgeon. I do know that they did a habitat or are in the process of doing a couple workshops right now that got delayed due to COVID. So we'll check in with them and get back to the board if there's any problems.
Great, thanks, Tony. I'm not sure we need to deal with this with a motion. We've got schedule changes that have been presented by Sarah on behalf of the Science and Assessment Committee, with the one change knowing that we'll be checking back in with the agency on sturgeon. Does anybody have any objections that they would like to bring up around the schedule?
Pat, I just wanted to let you know that Justin Davis had his hand up, maybe with a question. I'm not sure. It was up before you asked for.
Yeah. Justin, do you have a question, or is that remaining from the last topic?
I did have a question. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to be clear that in the new proposed schedule, there is still an update scheduled for striped bass in 2021.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Thanks, Justin. Sorry I missed your hand. Anybody else? We'll ask call for objections to modification of the schedule. Hearing no objections, there's consensus that the schedule be modified as presented. So thank you very much, Sarah. Any other issues, Sarah, that you need to bring before the policy board?
Nope, that's everything for me. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Let's quickly shift gear and go to the Habitat Committee report.
Okay, I'll wait for the presentation to come up. And thank you, Mr. Chair. If you don't mind, I'll start with the ACFIP update and then move to Habitat Committee, since ACFIP should be a little bit quicker.
That'd be great.
Okay, and then I'll take questions on both updates at the end. Okay, so Maya, next slide. Okay, the steering committee met virtually May 26th to the 27th. They received updates on current on-the-ground projects, an update on the conservation mapping project, which is very close to completion now. They discussed outreach and communication initiatives, came to consensus on the Melissa Laser Award recipient for 2020, and reviewed the 2020 to 2021 action plan. Next slide. The fiscal year 2021 National Fish Habitat Action Plan U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on-the-ground conservation funding RFP will be released in August this year. It's slightly delayed in order to incorporate the completed habitat mapping prioritization that we're wrapping up right now. And for those interested, if you want to see the announcement when it does get released, please sign up for our newsletter or follow us on Facebook. And you can do both of those via our website, atlanticfishhabitat.org. Next slide, please. Regarding project funding, since the last time I provided an update, ACFIP received Fish America Foundation funding, a small grant, and this project is being led by the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission Fish and Wildlife Research Institute. Currently, Florida Bay is experiencing sponge loss due to algal blooms, and so this project is growing 5,000 sponges for outplanting, and these sponges will benefit gray snapper, spiny lobster, and other species as well. Next slide. ACFIP also received funding from NOAA Recreational Fishing, and this funding will go towards a 1-acre oyster reef restoration project on the eastern branch of the Lynn Haven River in Virginia. This project is being led by the Chesapeake Bay Foundation and Lynn Haven River Now, and they're going to be actively engaging with fishers through site location for the oyster reef and also via outreach at the Virginia Rod and Reef Slam, angling for oyster restoration. TBD whether that will still take place in 2020, but if not, there's opportunity in 2021. Next slide. And we received funding through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service NFHAP as well. We put funding towards 4 different on-the-ground projects this year. The first one is Magothy River Shoreline Restoration in Maryland. This will restore 500 linear feet of shoreline to reduce chronic erosion. And they're using seeded reef balls and woody tree boles and root fans, and this will establish native plant tidal wetlands. The second project is the County Line Dam removal in New Jersey. This will remove the second dam on the Paulins Kill in order to open 3.5 river miles. Between this dam, the Columbia Dam removal, which we helped to fund in 2018, and the Paulina Dam, which is scheduled to be removed soon as well. In total, it will open 45 river miles for shad and river herring. The third project is an oyster reef restoration project in Mosquito Lagoon, Florida. And this will restore 420 linear feet of habitat and reduce erosion from boat wakes. And finally, we are helping to fund a stream restoration project on the town brook, which is in Plymouth, Massachusetts. And this will be replacing a 60-foot Alaskan steep pass with a 420-foot bypass channel with 2% slope and several resting pools. And it will open access to 269 acres of alewife spawning habitat. In total, we're putting $161,934 directly to on-the-ground restoration this year via NIFAP funding. Next slide. We also endorsed a project, the Upper and Lower Kickamuit River Dam removal. This is being led by Bristol County Water Authority and Save the Bay, and is taking place in Warren, Rhode Island. The dam was created in 1954 to protect water supply from tidal inundation after Hurricane Carol, but is no longer being used. And this removal will open 8 square miles for river herring and other species. Next slide. And ACFIP, as usual, would like to thank ASMFC for your continued operational support. And I'll move right into the Habitat Committee report, and I'm happy to take any questions on both at the end. Okay, next slide. The Habitat Committee met virtually May 28th to 29th. They received updates on the documents in progress, acoustic impacts to fish habitats of concern document, as well as the habitat hotline. We received an update on the Northeast Regional Habitat Assessment, as well as an ACFIP update. And we had a discussion on clean water and ecological flows. The Habitat Committee decided that their next Habitat Management Series document should focus on dissolved oxygen and pH based on this discussion. And finally, there was a discussion on living shorelines impacts to SAV, and I'll go into more details on the next couple slides for that. Next slide. There was a background document on this included in your briefing materials, and I'll hit the highlights in the next couple slides. Living shorelines, when properly sited, are a great alternative to hardened shorelines. They incorporate vegetation or other natural soft elements, and they promote shoreline stabilization, wave attenuation, they help with erosion control, and they improve fish habitat. The Habitat Committee supports the use of these softer, more ecologically beneficial means of protecting and stabilizing shorelines. Next slide. There's been streamlined permitting developed on state and federal levels, and living shorelines preference has been codified in some state laws and regulations. So there's generally been positive developments in terms of living shorelines. However, some states are placing living shorelines in close proximity to submerged aquatic vegetation beds, directly or indirectly impacting this important habitat for many commission-managed species. Submerged aquatic vegetation is an essential fish habitat and habitat area of particular concern for multiple species. And the ASMFC updated our SAV policy in 2018, emphasizing its importance. Next slide. The Habitat Committee recommends that shoreline stabilization alternatives to avoid or minimize impacts to SAV should be considered. A hierarchical approach to siting and design of living shorelines that incorporates avoidance and minimization measures should be demonstrated before unavoidable impacts to SAV are considered. Next slide. Because of the ecological importance of SAV, increasing instances of living shorelines and nature-based projects being proposed in conflict with SAV, continued reported losses of SAV along the Atlantic coast and worldwide, and difficulties associated with mitigating and restoring SAV that has been damaged or lost, the Habitat Committee requests the Policy Board approve the development of a living shorelines policy that would be protective of SAV. So they're asking to draft a policy, and then the Policy Board would have the ability to provide input on this draft policy and pass or not pass the policy. So the request is just to go ahead with developing a draft for you all to review at a future date. And next slide. As always, we welcome suggestions for action items that you would like the committee to work on, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you, Lisa. Is there any questions for Lisa on either of those presentations? Not seeing a lot of hands go up. Any objections to the development of a draft policy by the Habitat Committee as it pertains to SAVs and living shorelines? Steve Murphy.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have an objection to them developing a policy, but I do believe this is not a one-size-fits-all approach, and I think I understand the concerns of the committee where certain states have allowed, the development of living shorelines on SAV, but in North Carolina at least, we have general regional permit or general permit that we use through our coastal management. We also have those same considerations for protection of SAV built into the nationwide regional conditions, which is an option available to any state to do that as well, working with your regional core office. So, I just want to caution that I don't think one-size-fits-all approaches are the way to do this. I know it's just a policy, but policies have a tendency to be held over us from time to time on the state level. So, just wanted to make those comments as they move forward.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. On that particular topic, the question I was going to ask the question of Lisa: have you consulted with the different state coastal programs around this who are utilizing living shoreline approaches?
Well, this came up through the Habitat Committee, so all of the state representatives on the committee were at the discussion back in May, and we heard from multiple states that this is an issue. It is not an issue in every state in the ASMFC, but it was enough of a concern amongst the group that they thought a policy would be warranted. And there also seemed to be agreement from NOAA in the Northeast region that it would be helpful as well for their purposes.
Great, thank you. I've got Lynn Fagley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Lisa. It just helped me understand, I think it's fine to go ahead and draft a policy and see what it looks like, but I guess I'm a little confused. If living shorelines are being placed in proximity to SAV beds and potentially causing harm, I mean, isn't that better than putting a hardened shoreline there? So is it the idea that those areas just, there is no option? Or do you see what I'm saying? I'm not sure if there's a shoreline problem and an SAV bed at the same time. Is the policy going to try to help lead people to the best case solution?
It's a good question, and I think that's why they would like to help develop with a hierarchical approach. So in most cases, living shorelines are recommended over hardened shorelines, but the Habitat Committee thinks that there might be a happy medium where you could put possibly breakers or something farther out away from the shore and not in conflict with SAV that might help protect with some of that erosion. Also, having SAV in general helps promote shoreline stabilization to where you might not even need a living shoreline to begin with. So they want to have all of those options in the policy in order so that it's not just going to be, well, if you can't put a living shoreline, you're going to end up with riprap. It's not going to be a one size fits all like that.
Gotcha.
Okay, Shree Patterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I find a good utility in this, and I would definitely would be for this sort of action. And generally, my experience is that it provides more than a unilateral utility, and that it provides many sort of options for us to consider in a policy atmosphere. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Cherie. I don't have any more hands up right now. I think we've you've got a green light, Lisa, to go ahead and develop a draft policy to present back to the policy board for a future meeting to continue the discussion. So I appreciate the presentation on both of those areas. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We're about 5 minutes over. I am pleased to announce that the last agenda item is the review of non-compliance actions, and why I'm pleased is we don't have any reviews of non-compliant actions. So that is good news for the commission. Is there any other business to be brought before the policy board today? Looking for hands. I am seeing no hands. So with that, a motion to adjourn would be in order. Mel Bell is motion to adjourn, and I think Justin Davis has seconded it. So with that, thank you very much. I appreciate everybody's time and energy here today, and good luck with the remainder of the commission meetings. Thank you very much. Tony, any